It's Iraq Week in Washington, D.C. Started on Sunday. And actually,
there's a whole week for it?
Well, you know, a funny anecdote. On the anniversary of Putin's invasion, we had an entire week's worth of pieces on that. And then for the anniversary, I mean, you know, on the Ukraine stuff, it's just a lot. And, you know, there's a saturation to that sort of stuff with audience and things like that. So for the anniversary at my new gig, we just ran stuff on Sunday, which was the actual anniversary.
And we should just remind people, in case they don't know what you're referring to, that you are now part of the mainstream media in a really profound way. You are an editor at the Washington Post.
Yeah. The lamestream media, I think they call it, right?
Yeah.
The people. That's what the people call it. So we you know, devoted the Sunday print page to the opinions print page to the anniversary, and it's funny, you know, I've seen other publications. They sort of have been dribbling it out before and after, the sort of reminiscences and reflections. I guess it's sort of been an opportunity for supporters of the war to say why they were right or why they were wrong. But it's funny, you know, like we talked a lot about how we do it, and you know, there's on the one hand, there's a sense that I profoundly feel that we actually haven't had a reckoning with the war. But the counterpoint is actually, it has shaped our politics and our discourse for so long. I mean, we had about a decade of mea culpas from commentators, right? Like, I was wrong, I'm sorry. I mean, there was I forget when that was, when you had everyone from Andrew Sullivan on just sort of writing lengthy, teary-eyed, I was wrong essays. And to be fair, we got Obama because of the Iraq War. Like, there's no way that I mean, Hillary may have beaten him in 2008. He managed to really distinguish himself, especially as someone without a lot of experience at the national level, for being right on Iraq. I remember that very well in the elections. I mean, that was something he kept coming back to. It's like, I had the judgment, no one else in Washington did. I thought that was a pretty powerful thing that seemed to work. And then, you know, arguably, at least in part, we got Trump because of Iraq too, because he campaigned heavily on stupid wars and all the rest of it, right?
I don't think this is arguable. I think that Obama would not have been president had it not been for the Iraq War, and the Iraq War wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for 9/11.
Yeah.
So in some ways, Osama bin Laden caused Barack Obama to become president in some weird chain logic kind of way, and we wouldn't have had Donald Trump as president if it hadn't been for Barack Obama being president before him, because we all know how Trump sort of got the idea to really seriously run for president. In the White House Correspondents' Dinner, like whenever that was, 2012 or something?
Yeah, I think
and
right.
Obama basically humiliated Trump in front of the whole crowd, and you could see Trump just boiling. And I'm exaggerating slightly here. I mean, we don't know exactly what went on through Trump's mind, but there is some speculation that was a decisive moment in his own thinking about he wanted revenge, and he never forgot that in this like quite visceral way, this antipathy towards Obama. He had the antipathy before because of the birther thing, which I think people forget about, but in terms of thinking seriously about becoming president. But it's just like interesting to think about all the different counterfactual histories that we could have lived through if certain very specific things had turned out differently.
Yep.
And of course, I I don't know if you would have still been here, Damir, but I don't think wisdom of crowds would have existed if not for 9/11.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, it's the broader point is that, like, the Iraq War was an incredibly consequential moment. Well, yeah, I mean, so at the Post we focused on sort of the bigger picture and tried not to do a lot of this kind of I was right or I was wrong, but just sort of try and sort of take stock.
Before you go ahead, Damir, I do wonder if there is a single writer or analyst who had the exact inverse of what you said earlier, because we have a lot of people who supported the Iraq War, but now they say they were wrong. I wonder if there's anyone who was against the Iraq War at the time,
maybe
who
you
now who now thinks they're wrong, and they're like, the Iraq War was right, and I was wrong then.
I sort of was going to take you there,
really,
over time a little bit.
Oh, okay, yeah, that would be interesting.
I don't know.
That's not accurate, but
well, maybe by the end of this episode you'll change your mind.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, look, before we even get into that, I feel like the only piece. I mean, I was quite pleased with how what we managed to pull together at the Post, but I'm the only piece that really scratched my itch
was mine.
Well, yours always scratches some itch, but the one that really scratched my itch was a really furious piece in the Wall Street Journal by Gerald Baker. I don't know if you saw it. I'll put it in the show notes. But I don't have it here in front of me. But he had a line in there, something along like calling it the most catastrophic foreign policy decision by the United States since its founding. Since its founding. Since its founding, yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know. That's the part that sort of animates me more than. This is where I end up being the demon. More than the human costs of the war. For our soldiers and for Iraqi civilians and everything else. It's the thing that's been animating me this whole time has been, I think, how American Wilsonian ideals, when building to that kind of consensus that you're talking about in your piece, which we'll also link in the show notes in The Atlantic, how that actually forges that kind of dangerous consensus in the United States. And I've been reflecting about it. I'm very much for our supporting of Ukraine, but I look around me and I look at all the people supporting the war right now, and I'm just like, God damn it! And I really felt that last week with the Iraq War anniversary and sort of preparations for it. I was like, God, all you people, you're using the same arguments now for supporting Ukraine as were marshaled for the support of the Iraq War, and that's, I think, what somehow bugs me more than anything. I think this is where you and I will get into it, and this is where I'll get you to embrace that you were wrong to oppose it back then. Because
but Damir, they're not comparable. No one, to my knowledge, is calling for a ground invasion with American troops of Ukraine. That's,
well, but it's not so much the ground invasion. No one's calling that because it's politically impossible, largely because Russia's a nuclear state. But it has gotten to a point, and we saw this week Putin got indicted, an arrest warrant was issued for war crimes. That all amounts to a certain kind of declaration of regime change being necessary, or at least being morally required at this point. And I think that's where I'd push you on it too. Let me find it. I think it was Brett Stevens' column in the Times. Ends on the note. I won't find the quote right now, but ends on the note the one thing that he says was a an enduring good of the war, and that we're better off for it, was that Saddam Hussein is no longer there. And that's what he ends his sort of, I was wrong on some of the specifics, but I was right more than wrong sort of piece in the Times, saying that...
In other words, mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made. However, let's not lose sight of the fact that a brutal, autocratic dictator, mass murderer, is no longer there to basically be a predator on his people and countries around him. And so Saddam is gone, And to me, I guess that's my sort of question to you, is not so much, joking aside, whether you'd reconsider your stance against the war, but more like, clearly you'd agree with Brett on that, right? That the dictator's gone, and that's a good thing. Like that very narrow statement. Never mind the costs for the moment, but like...
Okay, I mean, I'd maybe go a step further. I don't think there is any kind of legitimate argument to the contrary.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like an uncontestable claim.
Yeah.
Iraq is better off now than it was under Saddam.
Yeah. And the level of disruption being a nice euphemism, again, you can do counterfactuals at how many people would have died eventually after Saddam fell, and, there's no succession, and civil war was perhaps inevitable, seen that argument a bunch. But it gets at that sort of question that's sort of, I guess bugging me about in the context of Ukraine and Russia, in the sense that I'm still not comfortable making some sort of case about Ukraine and Russia in terms of autocracy versus democracy. It reeks too much of the Iraq War, and in many ways, that's the part that I feel led us most astray in Iraq, was actually the logic that you espoused the most, and actually, even though you didn't subscribe to it at the time.
Oh no, okay,
but you know what I mean? Like it's that's the part that bugs me most about the current moment, about the rhetoric on Ukraine, if not our policy. And people criticize Biden for actually talking one way and actually being
overly
a realist, cautious mofo in the other. You've criticized him as such as well. But it's I feel like the main lesson of Iraq to me is that argument is no good. that the costs, and I'll just even narrow it, not like human costs, because again, tallying corpses, it's distasteful, and I think actually pointless work at the end of the day, because counterfactuals, how are you going to do that? I just go back to that Jerry Baker's assertion, this is the dumbest foreign policy decision since the founding, for all that it's done to our domestic politics, for all that it's done to American sort of behavior in the world, since, to its military preparedness, its just how it shaped us, as we were talking about earlier. It's just completely foundationally shaped the direction of the country since the invasion.
But in the opposite direction.
Yeah, but I don't feel like we've learned any lessons, and I don't think, and I feel like the real lesson of Iraq is the one that I've brought up so many times on this podcast, right? Which is my sort of also assertion that the world is a fundamentally tragic place, that perhaps acting in certainty to make it better, especially again, this is where I think is your get out of jail free card, especially through war, but not only through war, often leads to not just unintended consequences, but a mess. That the world's complexity is also such that it makes things differently. This is why when I talk about Ukraine and my own sort of, call it emotional commitments to what's happening there, is that it's just that these poor bastards are getting slaughtered by a neighbor that's just coming in. And insofar as we can help them defend themselves, I think that's fine. As soon as you slip into bigger ideological questions about changing the world for the better, again, is it better to allow them to defend themselves or just get destroyed? Again, I'm not counting corpses here. But I guess my primary thing is just like I feel that in Ukraine's case, my case is just like the poor bastards, are really in a bad pickle, and insofar as they can be aided in their struggle, they can be aided in their struggle. It's not about us; it's about them. Sure, why not? But anything bigger than that really makes me uncomfortable, and I think that's what sort of the last week has focused my brain.
Well,
so I don't know. There's a lot there. Go ahead.
Yeah. Let's unpack.
Yeah.
Let's unpack that. So when you say that a certain logic led to the Iraq War, a logic that I and others seem to espouse as it relates to Ukraine, just keep in mind the Iraq War did not have in any, the democracy argument that we are spreading democracy in Iraq and that is the goal to make it a democracy, that was not the primary justification, pretext. That was not how it was presented to the UN. That was not how it was presented to the American people. The fundamental justification for the Iraq War was on relatively narrow terms. The fact that Saddam supposedly had weapons of mass destruction. That was the argument. Mm-hmm. Now, there were some secondary arguments, like the fact if he has weapons of mass destruction, that means he's a mortal danger to the region. He will cause chaos and so forth. But those were all primarily national security justifications that you could have had from really any realist or neo-realist, advocate. You didn't have to be a true believer in democracy to be concerned about those things. And Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld were not, in fact, neoconservatives. They didn't have any particular enthusiasm for making the Middle East democratic. They were national security hawks who were obsessed with American primacy and the demonstration of a certain kind of overwhelming American power in terms of shock and awe. That was the term back then. So when people kind of push back against me and say, Shadi, your democracy rhetoric, what about the Iraq War? In my mind, and I think I'm right about this, they have to be separated because they are completely different things. Now, when the Iraq War, as the Iraq War went on, and certainly in the post-invasion phase, there was this kind of retrospective justificatory language that was used, and you started to see a stronger emphasis. And that's understandable because Iraq was, there was whatever you want to say about it, there was a transition, there was a first reasonably free and fair election, to January 2005, if I recall. Mm-hmm. So, but that's not, so I'm interested in just being clear about what phase of the war we're talking about and also the pretext for the war, which is different than, anyway, so that's part of it. But on the bigger claim that Iraq is better off now than it was under Saddam, that has no bearing on whether the war was justified because there are other outstanding considerations. The cost, just because there is 20 years later a better political system, for all of its faults, and there are many, Iraq is more democratic today than almost all of its neighbors.
Yep.
With maybe the partial exception of Lebanon in the Arab world. That's it. You can make an argument that Iraq is, on the, it's really in some sense on the upper end of what's possible in terms of democratic practice, in terms of just basic freedoms to criticize the government, to criticize ruling parties, to protest, to have a kind of rambunctious media space where people can actually propose strong opinions on things. Iraq has that. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of an utterly corrupt political class, that there isn't repression that ruling parties and prime ministers have used in the past and to this day. I mean, Nouri al-Maliki is an obvious example of that in the early 2010s. So, but that doesn't justify the initial invasion. And so one can have two seemingly contrasting opinions simultaneously. You can say that Iraq is better off now, and that's actually something to credit and to give credit where it's due, while also acknowledging that Iraq is a mess. So you can be democratic and still be a mess. And still face civil conflict. We all know that. Yeah.
Look, I would like to dig into that. I mean, in sort of trying to get pieces and talking to people, talking to Iraqis. I mean, I did get a sense, on the one hand, one of the pieces we ran, and there'll be another piece, I think, later on, so I won't talk too much about it. But one of the pieces we ran is, talking about the destruction of a coherent Iraqi identity, that basically sectarianism obviously had a language of its own, and I think it's acknowledged that that was always underlying Saddam's rule, and Iraqis would have had to contend with that. This falls into the unintended consequence of the war that we owe some responsibility to, and then the implementation of the Constitution and sort of the way the country ended up being governed. That it's sort of the line in the piece was something along the lines of it cast in marble or cut into marble the sectarian divisions in the Constitution. So you have that political thing now. So I thought it was an interesting, a good point to make, I think, about that sort of lasting consequence. But that has nothing to do with democracy. Fair enough. You can have a sectarian democracy that doesn't necessarily end up getting governed under the sort of very modern Western liberal sense that individuals are what matters, but where parties are manifestations of clan loyalties and sectarian loyalties, and that's how it works. Okay, it's democracy, and fine. I guess you can make some sort of argument that that's
and that Iraqis can at least build a future. They can imagine a future that they can be part of.
Right,
and there is. Yeah, which was not possible under Saddam.
And I was going to say, well, I mean, this I'll leave to Iraqis to debate. I have no idea. I've never been. The piece sort of does make the case that and it is the same sort of argument that I think surfaces, or at least is manifest in Svetlana Alexeyevich's secondhand time, right? Of people who lived under Stalinism in the Soviet Union. When faced with the turmoil of the 1990s in, post-Soviet Russia and Belarus and other countries, their lives before didn't have all the dignities and freedoms, and, these exalted things that democracy brings. But, you learn to live with that. And so you don't raise your head. And as you've noted in previous essays, not everything is politics, not everything is involvement. So, you learn to live with it, and you're provided with a kind of stability. And then when contrasted with the 1990s in post-Soviet Russia, which I think, in violence and disruption pale in comparison to what the Iraqis went through, there's at least a kind of nostalgia for the kind of stability and normalcy, maybe not stability, normalcy, that, you know, shaped normal life that was completely uprooted. That's, I think, one of the underlying arguments in the piece that we ran last Sunday. And we'll put that in the show notes as well for listeners to
Okay, but you know,
read.
so
but
yeah, go ahead.
I want to just ask you one more question, which is a counterfactual. So, you know, with all the flaws that entails, if the argument was made that, not retroactively, but at the time, that Saddam Hussein is a brutal dictator, genocidal, you know, arguably correctly labeled as such, you know, what he did to the Kurds in the north with the gassings, the end of the Iran-Iraq war, an unstable dictator, and that, you know, just stick with the genocide thing, you know? I mean, I think you've made similar arguments about Gaddafi and Libya, right? Like, we need to get rid of him. This is a dangerous man. So if that argument was made in 2003, instead of the yellow cake and the national security stuff and Rumsfeld and Cheney and all the rest of that, but if Bush's second inaugural, you know, the democracy inaugural actually was in place in 2003, and that was the logic, could you have been won over to the war?
Well, there was already some of that democracy rhetoric more broadly in 2003. It just wasn't the primary justification for
so
the
if
Iraq
it was
war
primary,
specifically.
could you have been won over to the war? Or maybe could today's Shadi have been won over to the Iraq
so
war?
a couple things here. First of all, the genocide, that pretext would not have been applicable in the case of Iraq in 2003 because there was not an ongoing mass killing that was happening in March 2003. In Libya, there was.
Well,
I mean, it was happening in real time.
Supposedly we stopped it, but, you know, you can't prove a negative. He was marching in and it was going to kill a bunch of people over there.
Already thousands had been killed. No, I mean, there was already gunning people down.
It's a war, though, right? Like, I mean, again, how do I put it? You know, like, civil war versus genocide. I mean, whatever. How many? Okay. I think it's between 100 and 200,000 Kurds killed. Now, I take your point, not in real time.
No, but that's a very different. It's a very different sequencing because the civil war in Iraq happened after we invaded. Mm-hmm. In the case of Libya, as you're suggesting right here, not only were there genocidal acts, there was the emergence of a civil war between Libyans, and then NATO invaded.
So I mean, what you're saying
is the sequencing is important here.
Democracy agenda plus ongoing civil war. Let's assume that you know, 1991 uprising against Saddam that Bush Senior basically ignored, let falter, somehow did manage to get traction. Iraq's starting to come apart, and it's taken 10 years of like low grade civil war. But by 2003, Saddam Hussein is maybe feeling less secure. The country's in worse shape. He's killing a bit more, and there's actually an ongoing civil war going on. Bush comes on and says, this is a tyrant. We have seen him kill 100, 200,000 Kurds. We must make Iraq a better place. We must invade, occupy, and bring democracy there.
You'd lose me there because that wasn't even what was done in Libya in 2011.
But you were unhappy.
There was not a ground. There was not a ground component. It was not a ground invasion with American troops, and there wasn't an occupation.
So it's the invasion occupation that's a sin in your part, not necessarily all the other stuff. Like,
well, I mean, I supported direct military action against the Assad regime during the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
2012, 2013, and so on. So, I mean, that's a pretty strong position that I hold. But what I was advocating in Syria was not a ground American invasion that was comparable to Iraq in 2003. So when people said, well, what about Iraq? Are we going to make the same mistakes again? Syria in 2013 had nothing to do with Iraq in 2003. Because no one, not even John McCain, was calling for a ground invasion of Syria. So So I just think that, like, once you actually get into these distinctions, they do matter quite a bit.
No, but I'm trying to nail you down on like what's the distinction. Basically, like what's your actual red line? So it's boots on the ground. It's the idea that we're going to build a democracy for people.
Yeah.
Your policy prescription is if there's an ongoing civil war against a brutal dictator, we, from the air and by airdropping and other logistical support, help out the insurgents.
Yeah.
And if they succeed, then we can send in USAID or wherever to help them state build.
Yeah.
That's the, yeah.
I mean, that's a kind of very, like, broad, oversimplified, but that is the general gist, and that is more or less what I supported in Libya.
Yeah.
And, you know, not to go into the details of Libya, but for those who haven't heard us discuss it in previous episodes, I suppose I'm one of the relatively small number of people who is still an outspoken defender of the original NATO intervention in 2011. And for those who want to hear that argument, I wrote a piece for Vox, interestingly, in 2016, and we'll include a link in the show notes. The title was something like, everyone thinks the Libya intervention was bad, here's why they're wrong. And I stand by, I'm pretty sure I stand by every single word in that piece 7 years later. I'll just add a couple more things that I think are important. On the nostalgia for a previous dictator, people's memories of the past are distorted. They have no accurate access to what they were experiencing in the time, because they are by definition. So if you're remembering something from the past, you're only remembering it in hindsight, unless you took very detailed daily diary notes and you can go back and then look at what you actually felt in the moment. No one's memory of the past is accurate. Sure. So there's this kind of built-in hindsight bias. So people say, well, hindsight is 20/20, maybe some of the time, but other times hindsight distorts our memory and actually makes us draw the wrong conclusions about past events. And everyone should know this just based on how they think about past relationships. No one can accurately render past relationships after a breakup. Either they're going to idealize the person for what they weren't, or they're going to emphasize the most negative aspects. And you see both examples with friends and family and all that. So I don't know why we should take seriously people's recollections of what it was like to live under Saddam. They don't know.
I mean, I'll let you go to other points, but I have to just jump in here because two fun things there. I like war and relationships being likened. That's good stuff.
Well, they say, I mean, all's fair in love and war. I mean,
right. No, you're not the first. And then, but the other part that's more striking is to say that, you know, people's, I don't know, to use the parlance of our times, and I cringe to do it, but people's lived experience can't be trusted. But at the end of the day, you're trusting people because democracy, because the people, and it's just people are inherently flawed and inherently have backward-facing sort of things. So it's interesting the way you put it there. There's almost this assumption that you know, the people, the poor dears who've suffered X, Y, and Z, now they're distorted. But you didn't say this, but, you know, implied, I, a social scientist who can see the big picture, can tell, you know, from study of history, from the study of broad historical trends, and I can tell you, peasant, that you're better off than you think you are. So I just want to point out that funny thing and allow you to correct that if you want.
I mean, that's not, okay, but that's not what I said.
Okay.
No, I mean,
sort of what you said.
I mean, it's an amusing interpretation of what I said.
It is sort of what you said. You said that people have distorted memories, and they may be better off than they think they are. And therefore, if they're unhappy with the situation, we should, you know, just tell them that they should accept the situation because they're better off even if they don't think they are.
No, I didn't say
social
like.
science
So I'm not suggesting that we as outsiders come in and tell them you are suffering from false consciousness. You are better off. Except be happy that Iraq is the way that it is now,
Fine.
and be happy.
You won't say accept, but you would say, an Iraqi you're talking to right now, it's like, well, you are actually better off. And you'd be like, I'm not better off.
But I would not say that because I don't think it's appropriate for an outsider to come in and
But you believe
speak
it.
that.
No, I mean, I'm getting at, maybe there's a more profound point there, which is, you know, since this is our philosophy podcast, it's like, you know, what's more real? An unhappy people suffering through shit, or some sort of empirical study from abroad that says, no, in fact, you know, you're on a path to the better place. No, I mean, I guess the sort of, the kind of, analogy that springs to mind is, you know, someone's diagnosed with cancer, and they're not feeling any pain at the time of the diagnosis, and then they're given chemo, and chemo sucks. It's really painful and horrible. And the doctor says, there, dear patient, we're making you better. I mean, also it's a pretty unsavory sort of parallel, but you know, maybe I'm just sort of pushing that because it's somewhat uncomfortable.
Yeah. So here, okay. So let me actually say something like perhaps that might be more controversial.
Let's go.
Yeah. I don't really feel that I can make definitive judgments for Iraqis to Iraqis. I mean, I think I just feel instinctually uncomfortable with that.
Right.
However, when it comes to, say, Egyptians, I think it is very difficult to take seriously a piece of commentary or anyone who lives in Egypt now who is writing about their experience, their lived experience. All of it's going to come with an asterisk. And that's one reason that if you're looking for scholarship on Egypt, you kind of have to filter out for definitely for Egyptians who are currently in Egypt. None of their accounts can be trusted or taken as academically rigorous. And that's just because of the basic constraint. Egypt is a dictatorship, and anyone who lives there who hasn't left for exile or emigrated or, I don't know, is writing it from prison and smuggling it out, no one who is above ground in Egypt can be trusted in any kind of public speech or writing to accurately render the way things are or the way things were. So I'm willing to say that, and that's not because there's something wrong with Egyptians. It's just acknowledging the constraints that people live under.
Right, but you know, I mean, another bizarre thing that comes from that is that like you're made to feel the truth under the torturer's, you know, torture implements in prison. That somehow clarifies the truth for you. I don't know. You know, the parallel of that is that, you know, I can't help but think that a lot of liberals feel that way analogously about a lot of their conservative American compatriots. They have false consciousness. They are acting because external things have you know, shaped this, that, or the other thing, but they don't see the truth, and the truth is knowable. And
I don't believe the truth is knowable.
No, okay, but you did say that, like, you know, you have to filter out for the noise of that. So you have to filter out for the noise of, again, lived experience. Sorry, I cringe, but like the lived experience of people living in red America. You have to filter out for that, because once you filter out for that, you get at something that's more accurate. Maybe not the truth. Truth is the wrong word, but more accurate. So that there's a kind of technocratic bias in how you're talking about this that parallels a lot of our shared criticisms of the technocratic bias in domestic stuff.
Okay, well, there's a fundamental difference. These arguments wouldn't apply to red state Americans or Trump supporters. None of these arguments are applicable in a democracy. We are a free country, And so you can't say that people are being repressed out of the truth. They have made choices, and they have agency, and the state is not coercing them to like Donald Trump.
Okay. No, that's interesting, but I wonder if it's a slightly
interesting.
No,
but
no.
irrelevant.
I mean it honestly. I always take all of our conversations seriously. I mean, we troll each other, but not like not that much. How do I put it? Walter Mead just had a column. He just got back from India. It was in the Journal as well on Monday. I think the title was something like "The BJP is the world's most important political party." And I think he's getting a fair bit of blowback on it because, he's pointing out that they're, quite broadly democratically legitimate. Their ideology is fundamentally illiberal, but it's playing to all sorts of, illiberal currents inside people. And, I mean, people are just jumping on him and saying, well, you're just whitewashing a lot of the truly horrific things that are happening in India right now. Modi and his goons are really cracking down on free thought. Any sort of opposition is being shut down quite brutally. Journalists are being hounded. I don't know. I saw some statistics recently on press freedom, where India ranks and all the rest of that. But it's a democracy, and they have democratic legitimacy. And I mean, maybe this points a little bit to that. I know that you do, and I mean, I do as well. I defend people's rights to be illiberal, right? Like that liberalism is not the truth, as many of our, I think, like liberal compatriots would like to hold it. Even though I think both you and I prefer liberalism on the merits to illiberalism. But it's a little messy, and I think like it's a little too tidy. It feels a little too tidy to say dictator crushes dissent, therefore anyone under a dictatorship is living in false consciousness, and then you get to a more liminal situation like, say, India today, which is democratically elected, broadly legitimate party with an illiberal ideology that is appealing, is now cracking down a lot on people. And I think you'd find anyone who finds himself in prison in India right now for opposing Modi would say that, would say something like India is no longer a democracy. I think you'd say that's demonstrably false. They have elections and they're electing people. But they'd say, freedom of speech is being curtailed. The people are, technically free to think what they want, but, not really. They're not getting the full picture. They're getting indoctrinated. So the democratic legitimacy thing is kind of a fig leaf, even already in India, among, the world's largest democracy, as people love to say. So I don't know. How do you square that, right? Like, I mean, it's that there's a slope there, right? That I think leads from like autocrat, which maybe is easy to sort of, as you have, put in a box, say anyone living under that is suffering from false consciousness. On the one side, and the other side, you have perfectly free democracy, and Trump never had any kind of hegemony to be able to shape people's minds, as you said. So there's no false consciousness. People are thinking what they're thinking. But then there's that middle ground, from Orban to Modi. Let's just stick to those two. I guess you could talk about Erdogan as well. And then you have still perhaps a democracy, but in its illiberalism, it's slipping to something that is starting to limit that freedom. So I don't know. How do you square that? And because I think it's not nearly as neat as you were saying, right? Yeah. So how do you work that through?
Okay, so there's another thing besides democracy versus autocracy here, which is countries that are experiencing existential politics. In other words, politics, a kind of politics that is so intense and so personally and deeply felt that makes it harder to assess the situation accurately, and that does apply to America. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And I think sometimes it can be helpful for non-Americans to write about American politics, and I wish there were more people who really did this on a regular basis, because they can keep some kind of distance. And I'm not going to pretend that, like, I have my biases too. They just happen to be different than the biases of the people who see everything through the prism of Trump being evil and the Republican Party being fascist. But all of us are, in some sense, protagonists in this struggle for the future of America. We all feel things strongly about what America is, what America isn't, what America will become, can become, should become. All of us are a part of that, and there's no way to create true intellectual and emotional distance. And I would also, another example is Egypt and its brief democratic experiment from 2011 to 2013. Because it was so polarized along Islamist and non-Islamist lines, and because that was so existentially fraught for Egyptian commentators, in other words, anyone who was educated and in the elite space of debate and discussion in the public sphere, it was very hard to find people who were in between. And what would that really even mean in this context? So you had to take everything with a grain of salt. Anyone who was anti-Muslim Brotherhood was not going to be able to see the picture clearly, because for them, the future of their country was at stake. The identity of the nation that they hold dear, was at stake. How can you accurately assess things when everything is riding on, whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood ends up in power, or if that's your perception? And then on the other hand, if you are a partisan of the Muslim Brotherhood, then obviously you're not going to be able to see the Muslim Brotherhood's flaws and faults, and there weren't really a lot of other options. Those were the two kind of big camps. Not partisan of the Brotherhood, but probably be sympathetic to the Brotherhood, and then you're kind of seeing how the other side is. It's sort of similar to what is happening in the U.S. now. This kind of cycle of polarization where sides just get dug in. So I think that honestly, it was outside analysts who were the better source of information on what was happening in Egypt at that time. And actually, I would say the New York Times and the Washington Post was pretty damn good in that respect. You had people who were not Egyptian. They did not have a personal stake in what Egypt would become. That is important. Some might say the exact opposite, that they didn't have a personal stake, so they're missing key things, but I would actually lean in the other direction.
Right. But that's foreign press. But I mean, so extrapolate that to the importance of a free press, right? And I mean, I guess that maybe like puts a fine point on where does a liberal democracy cease being a democracy, right?
So in terms of understanding India right now, I would have to be careful about Indian analysts, not because Indian analysts who are there right now, Indian writers and commentators and pundits, I would have to get a better sense of, are they pro-BJP? And I have to kind of filter that when I'm assessing their analysis, that's kind of what's going on. They've picked a side. Or if they're pro-Congress and see the BJP as the impending fascist party, I would just have to be careful. It doesn't mean I don't take their analysis, but I would have to just be aware of the context and what is coloring their view, and then I can go from there.
We have some evidence, though, that press is being impacted. I mean, we have, again, I don't know.
Right, and that's what I'm. Yeah,
how much you trust like press freedom, like rankings and things like that? Because honestly, I mean, a lot of this stuff's subjective, and I think if you do come out, I think that's a good tension you're putting there between like having a stake in the game and not. and objectivity, and the, on the one hand, foreigners having some objectivity, and the other not really understanding what's going on or what the stakes are. But I mean, we have pretty good evidence that he's cracking down on the press. I mean, I guess I'm not asking you to say at what point is it no longer a democracy.
Okay, well,
it's sort of an academic point, but it is an interesting one to sort of maybe press on, right?
Yeah, well, my view on that is, as you know, the conditions for democratic minimalism, a key one is elections have to be meaningful, competitive. The opposition has to have a realistic shot at winning. The playing field can't be so lopsided that the opposition has no hope and they become a permanent minority, because there just simply is no way to communicate their preferences to enough voters for enough voters to even know what the other option is.
Right.
And that's and that's obviously itself subjective.
It's tough, though, right?
It's tough to know exactly when you get at that point. And Hungary, I think, is a limit case.
Yeah.
And reasonable people can disagree. Turkey as well. Although Turkey, I would say, does meet at least the minimal condition of the opposition having a chance to win, because I think most Turkey analysts do think there is a legitimate chance that Erdogan might lose in the next election. It is plausible. And that tells us something about, for all of its faults and Erdogan's authoritarian actions, there is still a chance that the opposition can win. Elections are competitive.
Yeah.
They're not just pro forma.
Yeah. Again, it's a judgment call, of course, right? And impossible to know, because really it's just a poll, right? I mean, that's the thing. That's the nasty thing about this. But I guess it's just like I'm still. It's why for me at the limit these categories are a lot less meaningful than our rhetoric allows, and by that I mean autocracy and democracy. Because there's this massive squishy middle. Between one and the other, where you can have, electoral legitimacy and, be running pretty roughshod over society. And even the way you put it there, it's just like that there's a shot. Well, I mean, if Erdogan loses, a lot will potentially have to do with his mishandling of the earthquake, right? I mean, and so people are upset with that, and it may not have anything to do with the fact that avenues have been foreclosed to the opposition and things like that. That people will just be upset enough that they'll vote against him, and even with a crippled media, half-heartedly being able to give the opposition voice, it'll just be a thirst for something else. So as long as the institution of the vote exists and the mechanisms of voting are not so completely corrupted that there aren't literally people at every ballot box stuffing, votes in for Erdogan, there's your minimal democracy. You can still be pretty abusive of civil society and everything else, right?
Yeah, well, so I'm not even really comfortable anymore calling Turkey a democracy, and if people actually follow along, I don't think I've said that for a couple of years now, because I'm just not sure. And I'll admit that I don't know exactly where the line is. But I think in the case of Turkey, there's considerable evidence that, Turkey is one of the worst countries when it comes to press freedom. I shouldn't say one of the worst countries, but globally, but it is one of the worst countries in terms of how many journalists are in prison or have been threatened with detention, in terms of just kind of absolute numbers. Now, obviously, Turkey's press space is better than, I don't know, pick a dictatorship. But among let's say, not absolute dictatorships, Turkey is pretty bad on press freedom. Mm-hmm. And that's just undeniable. And there is a question of to what extent opposition groups can communicate effectively with their constituencies and building an audience and building and actually being able to reach out to voters in the way that they might like to. And obviously there's also attempts to ban political parties and expressions of Kurdish identity. I mean, there's a lot of things on the list that you can look at and say, this is making the playing field very lopsided in favor of one party. So that's why I think it's just better to say Turkey does have still has elements of competitive elections. But the other things that are important for even a minimalistic democracy are in question. Yeah. So it's probably just a borderline case. Hungary, again, I don't know enough. I mean, it's not for me to say, and that's why I'll defer to like Hungary experts. But Hungary is concerning in terms of it's probably there on the precipice in certain ways. And India is somewhere on the precipice. And then reasonable people can disagree about where exactly to draw the line. But does it really matter that much to what extent we're saying we don't have to call it one or the other because it is a continuum?
Yeah.